I just spent the last week driving 2,500 miles, sleeping out of the back of my car, and shooting every single sunrise and sunset while capturing fall colors all around Colorado and Utah to determine whether or not this lens could be crowned the best wide-angle travel lens for the money, or whether it's just a cheap knockoff. So let's find out. This is the new Tamron 2240 f2.8 for the Sony E-mount. It's a full-frame wide-angle lens whose unique focal length alone is sure to turn a few heads, but is it any good? And can it knock off the 16-35 Sony G Master, my all-time favorite travel lens? Now, a quick disclaimer. Tamron did send me this lens to try out while I was traveling, but no money changed hands and they have no say in what I say, and they don't get to see this video before you do. So let's first talk about that focal range. When traveling for things like this road trip in Colorado or backpacking trips in the mountains, or even something as simple as an everyday walk-around lens, I'm typically trying to keep my kit as light as possible, which means I'd preferably like to stick to just one lens. But then I'm stuck with the mortal dilemma akin to Christian Bale in The Dark Knight. Where are they? Rachel or Harvey. 16-35 or 24-70. The 16-35 leaves me feeling like I'm a little bit limited to only super wide, while the 24-70 leaves me feeling like it's a little bit too narrow. In testing this lens, I found that 20mm is the perfect wide angle parameter. Honestly, 16-19 is a little bit wider than I think is necessary for 95% of circumstances. I think a true test of this was on a stop in Moab at the end of the trip, photographing this 105-foot tall arch. 20mm was more than enough to capture a bunch of different compositions that I was happy with, and we added a little cheeky sky swap at the end for some special sauce, and I think we have a winner as well. Not to mention that 20mm is the perfect focal length for vlogging. 24 is definitely too tight to give your viewer context, and 16 is far too distorted and wide. On the long end, I've often felt that something around 50mm is typically good enough for most scenarios. So does 40mm feel like it's close enough for those close-ups and portraits? Well, not exactly. 40mm, especially at f2.8, was nice for something like this portrait of my buddy Jacob, and we've got some nice bokeh and background separation, but I'm still finding myself reaching for that longer lens a little bit more often than I would hoped when out on my trip. That said, if you're pairing this with any of the higher megapixel Sonys and you can crop in, I think you'll find that borrowing a few of the extra millimeters on the wide end to loan on the top end of this lens will make it a much more versatile lens that I'd personally feel a lot more confident if it were the only lens that I had with me when I was on the go. Speaking of being on the go, let's talk about the form factor and the build quality of this lens. First and foremost, it is tiny. It's basically right around the same size as the 24mm G Master or the 35mm G Master, or if you're more familiar with Tamron lenses, it's definitely smaller than the 17-28. But if you're comparing it to something like the 16-35 G Master, it's comical how much smaller this is, and almost half the weight at 365 grams. The build quality is also pretty up to par with most of Tamron lenses. It's a plastic build, but it's definitely solid and it feels well built. You've got the weather sealing ring, the focus zoom ring feels nice, and you have that 67mm thread that you have with most of the Tamron lenses. The zoom ring is a little bit more loose than I would personally like. If I set my focal length, I want to be sure it stays there, but with this Tamron 20-40, it feels a little bit like a cat that you don't know that well. If you so much as touch it wrong, it's going to freak out on you. Tamron's marketing says it's supposed to be quick adjustable, so they're touting this as more of a feature than I would personally like, but to each their own. But the major thing that this lens is lacking from a build perspective is a MF and switch. By that I mean a manual focus switch. Personally, as someone who switches from photo to video mode, I really need the ability to switch quickly into manual focus, because there are countless scenarios where autofocus, especially for video, just doesn't cut it. It's not a function of the lens, it's just how autofocus works. Again, this is mostly just on the video side, but maybe you're an MF kind of person as well.
It's the one that says bad motherfucker.
Of course, you can always program a function button to switch focus modes for you, but if you're like me and you don't have a spare button, you have your customization set the way you want it, this can certainly be a little bit annoying. For the price point though, you have to spend a substantial amount of more money if you want a wide zoom that has a manual focus switch. But more on that in a second, so be sure to stick around till the end. While on the topic of focusing, the autofocus is super snappy. When taking photos, I had no issues using any of the focus modes or eye autofocus. I never felt like it was hunting or missing focus, and even the tracking modes felt great as well. On the video side, I am super impressed as well. I'm actually filming this on this lens right now, and the eye and face tracking is working super well. I'm also super pleased that there's no focus breathing, which has plagued the G Master Prime lineup. The low light autofocus performance also did really well. I did some testing when we were sitting by the campfire making dinner, and that 2.8 aperture definitely helped for the low light. Also, please direct any of the hate on the knife skills in this video to Jacob. Maybe toss a couple knife emojis in there. I don't know what he's doing with that knife. Now, of course, one of the most important factors in determining if a lens is worth adding to your kit is the actual optics of a lens. Are we getting 4K handsome Squidward or the bootleg 8-bit version of Squidward? Well, I'm happy to report that we've got ourselves one dashing cephalopod because the images coming out of this lens are pretty great. I found the lens to be super sharp in basically all scenarios I put it through, both wide open at 2.8 and stopped down as well. Going back to this portrait of Jacob, we can see deep into his soul in those eyes of his, and we're getting tons of detail in the image up in the mountains as well. Something I also always like to test with wide angle lenses is the sun stars. I'll give this one about an 8 out of 10 on the arbitrary sun star scoring rubric. The 9-bladed aperture gives us a nice 18-point sun star, but it does flare a little bit out towards the edge of the star tips. Now the 16-35 G Master is still the GOAT when it comes to sun stars. If we compare it to these images that I took on the G Master in Yosemite, it's still no contest. Another important thing to look at for wide-angle lenses is flaring. Even in some pretty flare-inducing scenarios in the trees, I was impressed by how minimal the flares were. Tamron doesn't specifically call out any anti-flare coating, but it is definitely great to see. So is this lens worth it? Well, at a mere $699 price point, this lens is pretty much impossible to beat for what you're getting. Let's just compare to the other wide-angle zooms that you have at your disposal for Sony. The new 16-35 f4G is nearly double the price at $1,198. The super dated Sony Vario 16-35 f4 is $1,000 new, but you can definitely find it secondhand for $650 to $700 maybe. The 16-35 G Master, my favorite wide-angle lens that I've been shooting with since it was released in 2017, is pushing over $2,000. And then even the Tamron 17-28 f2.8 is $799. So when we consider the uniqueness of this lens, the image quality, the overall performance, the lightweight nature of it, the fact that it also has weather sealing, I have no doubt recommending that this is the best value wide-angle lens for Sony shooting. Honestly, I'm sad I have to send it back, and I'm even considering downgrading and selling my 16-35 G Master in exchange for this one and a little bit extra cash. But I'm curious, what do you think? Is this something you'd be excited to try? Is it something you'd be excited to have in your kit? Is it something that you think you could have as just the one lens with you, especially when you travel? Let me know down in the comments. I would love to know what you think. So if you did like this video, I think you'll like this video next, and here is a YouTube short that you might like as well. Why don't you give those ones a watch while I'm making your next video? Peace.